I know we're moving on time. One of the things, because we as humans have a short attention span, right? We get tired really quickly. I mean, people are tired of COVID-19. That's probably a whole different story. But people are also going to get fatigued with the racism conversation. And so how do you take a heavy topic like this, and what can you kind of tell people to do to keep from being fatigued by talking about this subject?
I really love that question, because most people they don't think to ask it. And I personally, I'm all about health and wellness and self-care, and for everyone. So, doing this work, I always say this, like, doing this work is hard enough if you're doing it on your own, but it's impossible if you don't have a team of people or a group of people or even one other person to share what you're experiencing as you go through it. Please don't try to do this work on your own. And if you are alone, please reach out, because we need to be supporting each other in this work, no matter, when I say that, I don't mean white folks in particular. I mean, we all need to be supporting each other. And for those of us who've been doing the work for, decades, and it's been, our career, let alone, for you, Cody, like your life experience, right? So, getting tired, like, yeah, it's exhausting. Like, all of a sudden people are coming out of the woodwork to have these conversations, and you're like, okay, well, glad you're, happy to have you join us, but it's been going on for a while.
Yeah.
And so thinking about, if you are new to the movement and you haven't really engaged in these kinds of conversations before, I strongly would encourage you to do more listening than speaking when you start. Just not to shut you down or to silence you, but just know that you're stepping into some work that's been going on for literally centuries. And so do some homework. There's tons of resources out there. I've got a lot on my website under my resources for denasamuels.com. You can find some good starting places there. There's just tons and tons of resources we have access to now. So that's one thing. And then as far as getting tired and overwhelmed by it, my response to everyone is to figure out on a daily basis what you need to take care of yourself. So if it's a few minutes of, being calm, I use mindfulness. I have guided meditations. I have my own guided meditations are on Insight Timer. I have a few on my website. That if those would be helpful. Some of them are about your own health and wellness. Some of them actually incorporate the idea of social justice in there. And so, but I would say for everyone, we all need to figure out whether it's going for a walk, being out in nature, just breathing fresh air, those kinds of things, making sure that you do that every single day to some extent for a few minutes at least. Yeah.
Great. Yeah. Now you did touch on a couple of things that people can do to get started. I know we're coming on time and I want to leave a little time for questions, but can you give a few, just here are some steps? You talked about a couple of things. Go do some research, do some reading. Don't try to do this on your own. Do some homework. What are some other things that people can take away from this to just go and get started to to try to make an impact in this area and to make a contribution?
I would say to find whatever courage you have within you as a starting place and start the conversation. So what that means is calling up a friend who you think you might be able to talk to about this. And I'm not suggesting, especially for white folks, to call up a person of color that you happen to know that you're not really close with, but you're like, oh, I'll talk to that person. Please don't do that. They've got enough on their plate that they're dealing with right now. And it's a very emotional time as well. All of this is being called up to the surface through all the protests and everything else that's going on right now. It's a very emotional and volatile time, especially for folks of color. And so we want to, I think all of us should be just aware of that. But reaching out to somebody who's truly a friend, who you think you can have a conversation with, is not a bad starting place. Again, as we mentioned already, doing your research, looking for resources so you can learn, you can do your own work, learning about what your own biases are. One of the things that I train, you know, I provide in my trainings is I always talk about learning your biases from the implicit association test that you can take at Harvard's Project Implicit. If you just Google Harvard Project Implicit, they have these tests. I'm not going to go into great detail, but for those of you who are unaware, they take about 5 minutes each. And, you know, there's one on race, there's several on gender, there's some on social class, sexuality, all of these different social identities. And it gives you results right away. You just follow the directions on screen, and it's testing what your implicit bias is. It's measuring, and it comes out with a score. And more than 10 million people have taken these tests. So we know that it's a robust sample. We don't tend to have, in social science research, we don't have that kind of subject pool for almost anything. So this is great. It's very good, but please don't stop there. Don't say, oh, well, now I know, because it comes out with a sort of the score of, you have a strong automatic preference, for example, for whites over blacks, or a moderate preference for whites over blacks, or slight preference, or no preference, and then it flips for, you know, blacks over whites. And so you get where you came in, and it also gives you where you fit in compared to all the other people who have taken the test, aggregated data. So it's great information to start with, and then you need to know, what do I do with this bias? You can't just say, oh, well, now I'm aware. You need to learn about, how do you mitigate, how do you minimize these biases, not only in terms of on an individual basis, but also on organizational level. So you're looking at both of those. Again, my training, my implicit bias training, goes through a whole bunch of strategies on that. There's other resources that you can find. If you don't, you know, if you don't go with me, there's lots of other people. Just make sure they're not stopping at awareness, that you need to go into the actual skill building.
Yeah, no, I think that's great. You know, there are a couple of things that's just that I would suggest people do, and I think you hit on this, is doing the homework for sure. And then I think the biggest thing is, don't try to sugarcoat something, and don't try to get the language exactly right. Just ask your question and just speak truth to power to get a baseline to start the conversation. So don't be afraid to start. I think the biggest thing is just to start, and from a genuine place. The other thing that you can do, I mean, if I were a white male today, I'd look around at the system, right? If you don't believe in systemic racism, which is a whole nother conversation, just look around and see, because the racism piece has the power component. So see who's in charge, see who has the money, see who's in what neighborhood, look at where the transfer of wealth happens generationally. And those are things that you can just look and say, I can actually see this with my own eyes. Doesn't mean that people didn't work hard for it, but I think it requires a person to step back and actually question some of the things that you've always taken for granted. And I watched a video the other day of an interview of an ex-slave, and he talked about when the slaves were freed, they were basically just thrown out with nothing, no resources, right? And no ability to go get those things. So this is not a history lesson on slavery, but it's one of those things where just look around and trust your eyes, and check your own kind of bias, right? And what you know about what you know may not actually be reality when you go in. And so I think just asking those questions and getting really curious about what's next, and be intellectually curious about what is really happening.
Awesome. Yeah, thank you.